All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most incredible stories ever told, Luke chapter 24. But here's the thing, this isn't just a chapter to read. We're going to experience it, see it, feel it, moment by moment. So let's start where the story does, in its darkest hour.
Okay, so picture this. It's the third day. The air is cold, that pre-dawn chill, and it's just heavy with grief. I mean, just 3 days ago, everything they hoped for was crucified. Now, that hope is sealed behind this enormous stone in a tomb that wasn't even his. It feels final, hopeless. This is our starting point. But right here, in this place that feels like a total ending, well, this is where everything is about to flip completely upside down. Our first scene? It's right there, at the tomb. So let's get into the action. Verse 1 tells us that super early on Sunday morning, a group of women head to the tomb carrying spices they'd prepared. Just picture them. Their faces are etched with sadness, and they're carrying these heavy jars for one last act of love. Then verse 2, they get there and just stop dead in their tracks. They're staring because the huge stone is rolled away from the entrance. Imagine their shock. This thing was massive. And then in verse 3, they go inside, but Jesus' body is gone. The place is just empty. Okay, so what happens next is wild. In verse 4, while they're completely baffled, suddenly 2 men in clothes that are shining like dazzling bright appear right beside them. Picture the shock. Then, verse 5, the women are terrified. They bow their faces to the ground, and that's when the men ask this incredible question. And in verses 6 and 7, they follow it up. He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise? That question just hangs in the air, changing absolutely everything. And right then, verse 8 says, they remembered his words. It all comes rushing back. So, they run. Verse 9 shows them leaving the tomb and telling all this to the 11 apostles and everyone else. But look at the reaction. Verses 10 and 11 tell us that their story, this unbelievable news from Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and the others, sounds like nonsense to the apostles. They just don't believe them. You can almost see their faces fall as they're met with total skepticism.
But one person has to see for himself. In verse 12, it says, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Imagine his face, a mix of doubt and this tiny spark of hope. He gets there, stoops down and sees just the linen cloths. That's it. And he walks away, just marveling to himself at what had happened. He's not sure what it means, but he knows something impossible is going on.
Okay, so while Peter is processing that, our story shifts. We leave the buzz of Jerusalem behind, and now we're following 2 disciples. They're walking away from the city, and you can just see the defeat in the way they walk.
Verse 13 sets the scene. It's that same day, and 2 of them are walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walk, verses 14 and 15 show them deep in conversation about everything that's happened. And that's when Jesus himself draws near and starts walking with them. But here's the crazy part, verse 16. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. They're literally walking with a resurrected Jesus, and they have no idea.
So in verse 17, the stranger asks them what they're so sadly discussing. And in verses 18 through 24, one of them, named Cleopas, just stops. He's like, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened?" He then lays out the whole tragedy, how Jesus, this mighty prophet, was handed over and crucified. He tells them how they had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. He even mentions the women's story about the empty tomb and the vision of angels, but you can hear it in his voice. It all just feels like a sad, confusing end.
And then the stranger starts to talk, and his words just cut through all their sadness. In verses 25 and 26, he gently calls them out, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then verse 27, this is amazing. Starting with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them everything in the scriptures concerning himself. It's literally the greatest Bible study ever, happening right there on a dusty road. And all of that talk, all of that connecting the dots, leads us right to the climax of their journey, the moment where all goes from confusing theory to crystal clear reality.
So in verse 28, they get close to their village, and Jesus acts like he's going to keep walking. But they just can't let him go. The conversation has been too good. So verse 29 shows them pleading with him, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." They just have to keep this going.
So he goes in to stay with them. And what happens next? In verses 30 and 31 is the big moment. They're at the table, and he takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. And in that one simple, familiar action, bam!
Their eyes are opened. They recognize him. It's Jesus. And in that exact same instant, he vanishes from their sight.
Can you imagine the silence in that room? Verse 32 shows them looking at each other, totally stunned, and they say it out loud. Did not our heart burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? That warmth they felt, it was him. So what do? Verses 33 through 35 tell us they get up that very hour, race the 7 miles back to Jerusalem in the dark, and find the 11 apostles. They burst in and tell them everything, just as the others are saying, "The Lord has risen indeed."
And that brings us right back to that locked room in Jerusalem. The energy is electric, anxious but hopeful. And just as these two are telling their story, the impossible is about to happen. Again.
In verse 36, as they're still talking, Jesus himself suddenly stands among them and says, "Peace to you." But check out their reaction in verses 37 and 38. They're not joyful, they're startled and terrified, thinking they're seeing a ghost. And Jesus' question is so gentle, aimed right at the heart of their fear.
So Jesus doesn't just use words. He gives them undeniable proof. In verse 39, he says, "See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And verse 40 says, "He then showed them his hands and his feet." He's inviting them to use their senses to believe an impossible truth. He is physically real.
But even then, verse 41 says that while they were disbelieving for joy and marveling, they were just struggling to process it. So Jesus provides one last, very human proof. In verse 42, he asks, "Have you anything here to eat?" They give him a piece of broiled fish, and verse 43 says he took it and ate it before them. That's it. A ghost doesn't eat. He is truly, physically back. Okay, so now belief has finally taken root. It's real. He's here. And at that point, Jesus shifts their focus from what just happened to what is going to happen next. He gives them their purpose.
In verse 44, Jesus reminds them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And then verse 45 says he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And in verse 46, he connects it all, explaining it was written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead. Suddenly it all makes sense.
And with that understanding comes a mission. Verse 47 lays it out. Repentance and the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, starting right there in Jerusalem. And then verse 48, he looks at them and says, "You are witnesses of these things." And in verse 49, he gives them a promise. They won't be doing it alone, because he is sending the promise of his Father upon them, a power from on high.
And that leads us to the final, breathtaking scene of this entire chapter, the culmination of everything they've just been through.
Verse 50 says he led them out as far as Bethany, and there he lifted up his hands and blessed them. Then in verse 51, while he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. But look at their response in verse 52. They worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. No sadness, no fear, just joy. And verse 53 tells us they were continually in the temple blessing God.
I mean, think about it. In a single day, they went from absolute despair to terror, from confusion to understanding, and finally to this deep, unshakable joy. Their personal story with Jesus walking on earth was over, but their mission as witnesses to that story, that was just getting started. And it leaves us with a question, doesn't it? When you're faced with a truth that changes everything, what do you do next?